Welcome to the Workers' Reading Room. Tonight I'll be reading American Trade Unionism by William Z. Foster. I'll be reading multiple chapters because these ones are quite short. So this is chapter 18, 19, 20, and 21. Chapter 18, The Trends Toward Independent Unionism. Since 1912, the TUEL and its predecessor organizations, the SL of NA and the ITUEL, had carried on a stout fight against dual unionism. But now in the latter Coolidge period, 1926 to 29, forces were at work that were gradually pushing the TUEL towards a partial policy of independent unionism. Indeed, there had long been a potential base for such unionism in the great masses of deeply exploited, unorganized workers in the mass production, trustified industries which the AF of L had been unable and unwilling to unionize. This was true in spite of the fact that such dual organizations as the IWW, the WIIU, etc., because of their ultra-revolutionary programs, hostility to AF of L workers, and general sectarian practices, were never able to build any independent unions on a permanent mass basis among the huge numbers of unorganized. The general course of events in the post-war Coolidge years had tended greatly to strengthen the potential basis for independent unionism and finally put before the revolutionary movement as a living issue the question of forming new unions. Let us cite four of the general forces tending to produce this result as follows. 1. There was the narrowing down of the AF of L base in many industries during the great post-war employers' offensive, including the complete wiping out of its unions by strikes in the steel, lumber, and meatpacking industries, the crushing defeat of the railroad unions in 1922 with a loss of several 100,000 members, and the eventual breaking down of the UMWA in the bituminous fields. Besides, there was a serious weakening of the unions in various other industries, including building trades, marine transport, printing, needle, textile, food, shoes, etc. In consequence of these strike defeats, the worst in our labor history, the numerical strength and strategical position of the AF of L had been greatly weakened and the percentage of unorganized workers much increased. Especially the AF of L had lost great masses of unskilled workers and tended to become more and more an organization of the skilled labor aristocracy. 2. There was the adoption by the AF of L of its no-strike, union management cooperation, higher strategy of labor program. This policy of class collaboration, by distorting the unions from their basic role as fighting organizations into adjuncts of the employer's production speed-up, killed the militant spirit of the unions and inflicted upon the labor movement a disastrous dry rot. As a result of it, the unions, during the Coolidge prosperity years, were not only not able to recover their losses in the big post-war strikes, but as we have seen, for the first time in history, had steadily declined in strength and influence. The AF of L became less able than ever to defend its own members' interests and to organize the unorganized. 3. There was the expulsion of large numbers of militant and revolutionary workers from the trade unions, a fact which robbed these organizations of their best elements and hastened their decline. In consequence of these expulsions, the TUEL militants, largely outside, found it very difficult to work within the AF of L unions, which, to make matters worse, were gangster-ridden and bereft of democracy. 4. There was a new and growing tendency among the organized and unorganized masses to fight, exemplified by such bitter, hard-fought strikes as the Passaic textile workers, the New York fur and cloak makers in 1926, the National UMWA strike of 1927, the Boston shoe workers strike, the New Bedford textile strike, and the great 1929 strikes of textile workers in Gastonia, Elizabethton, and many southern towns. This developing strike movement could not be stimulated, developed, and led to victory by the corrupted leaders of the half-dead AF of L unions with their no-strike policies, but was in every instance directly sabotaged by them. All these factors combined show a definite decline of the AF of L unions in strength and fighting ability, Their heavy loss of members and spirit-killing class collaboration, the mass expulsions, and the growing urge for organization among the unorganized all worked together to prepare the ground for independent unionism, especially in the three major fields of TUEL activity: mining, textile, needle. The basis for new unions was definite and strong. In the mining industry, the bituminous sections of the UMWA had been wrecked. The militants stood expelled in great numbers, and the miners, with long organization experience, were bitter against the UMWA and definitely disposed to form a new union. After the disastrous 1927 strike, this tendency manifested itself by the growth of a whole series of spontaneous local dual organizations in Canada, Colorado, the IWW, West Virginia, Keeney, Illinois, PMA 1932, Oklahoma, the Anthracite Districts, etc. A general outcropping of new unions was taking the place of the collapsing UMWA. In the textile industry, the tendency towards independent unionism took a somewhat different course, but the general direction was the same. The UTW and the other textile unions, containing only 5% of the workers, were paralyzed by the intense class collaboration practices of the period, and were both unable and unwilling to respond to the demands of the discontented workers in the industry for a fight in behalf of their demands. The result we have seen in the Passaic, where the TUEL, in spite of its intense anti-dual union attitude, was compelled to form an independent union in order to organize the workers. In the needle trades, the course towards independent unionism was again somewhat different, but nonetheless sure. The reactionary course of the union leadership, the steadily worsening economic conditions, the expulsion of almost 50,000 militant workers, all created a growing mass demand in the industry for a new, fighting industrial union. But the TUEL, traditional fighter against dual unionism, strongly resisted these mass demands for new unions. In the mining industry, for example, at the big April 1st, 1928 Save the Union Pittsburgh Conference, representing 100,000 miners, there was a strong trend to launch a new union, but it was defeated by the TUEL and Communist Party opposition. Most of the above-mentioned new unions in the mining industry were initiated by socialists and other non-communists. In the textile industry in Passaic, even after the TUEL had been compelled to form a new union, we were opposed to its independent existence and proceeded to affiliate it to the torpid UTW. This indeed being our line in all industries where we built new unions among the unorganized. And in the needle trades, it was the TUEL that was responsible for stopping the split at the Philadelphia Convention of the ILGWU, and for generally having the masses of expelled workers adopt the policy of fighting for reinstatement in their old organizations. Just in the midst of these developments, on December 3rd and 4th, 1927, the TUEL held its third national conference in New York, whither the organization had just removed its headquarters from Chicago. There were 297 delegates, of whom 107 were from the needle trades. In total, they represented a following estimated at 300,000, or about 10% of the trade union movement. The conference clearly realized the menace arising from the smashing of the AFL in many industries, its failure to organize the unorganized, its fatal no-strike class collaboration policy, and its reactionary trend in general. It stated that the unions were in full retreat before the employer's economic, political, and ideological offensive, and declared that the very existence of the trade unions was endangered. But it did not understand these developments as laying the basis for independent unionism. On the contrary, the whole orientation of the TUEL Third Conference was towards the AFL. It directed all its efforts to an intensification of the fight within the old unions against class collaboration, for trade union democracy, for the organization of the unorganized, for the Labor Party, for unemployment insurance, against trade union capitalism, labor banking, against racial discrimination, for world trade union unity, etc. It called for the many expelled workers to fight for reinstatement into their former unions, and it put forth as a central slogan, "Save the trade unions." 1936. Chapter 19. The Trade Union Unity League. The TUEL began its reorientation and policy towards independent unionism during the middle of 1928 by the organization of new unions in the three industries where it had its most substantial forces: mining, textile, and needle, and where, because of wholesale expulsions, decline of the AFL unions, etc., conditions were ripest. The first of these unions to be set up was the National Miners Union at its convention in Pittsburgh, September 1928. The miners were badly disorganized after the loss of the great 1927-28 strike, and only some 15,000 joined the new organization. The second union established was the National Textile Workers Union in New York, September 1928, with about 5,000 members. Then came the Needle Trades Workers Industrial Union, founded in a convention representing 22,000 workers in New York, January 1929. All these membership figures are only approximate, as the dues systems were as yet poorly organized. The founding of the TUUL. The TUEL held its fourth national conference, or, more properly, convention, in Cleveland, August 31st to September 1st, 1929. There were present 690 delegates from 18 states, including 15 delegates from the Pacific Coast. Of these, 322 delegates came from the three new industrial unions, then comprising approximately, probably as an excessive estimate, 57,000 members, 159 delegates from left-wing groups and trade unions, 107 from small groups in unorganized industries, 18 directly from AFL locals with 2,855 members. 40 were members of the TUEL National Committee and 44 fraternal. 64 were Negroes, 72 women, and 159 youths. The average age of the delegates was only 32 years. The convention reorganized the TUEL and changed its name to the Trade Union Unity League. This was in conformity with the new tendencies in our movement, which were enthusiastically supported by the big convention delegation. The new constitution provided for three types of national organization: A. Industrial unions, B. Industrial leagues, and C. Trade union minority groups. A. The national industrial unions, adapted and formed to the conditions in each industry, were based upon the principle of one shop, one industry, one union. They were departmentalized, corresponding to the important subdivisions of their industries. They had autonomy to elect their own officials, set their dues rates and initiation fees, work out their detailed programs and union agreements, and conduct their own strikes, subject only to general TUUL control. An important feature was their youth sections. B. The National Industrial Leagues were industrial unions in embryo. They were loose national groupings of local unions, shop committees, and individual workers. Bodies not yet strong enough to function as unions, their dues were set and their general activities supervised by the TUUL, National Executive Board. C. The National Trade Union Minority Groups were a continuation of the old TUEL National Industrial Sections working within the conservative unions. Where AFL and TUUL unions existed in one industry, the TUUL union was connected with the TUUL minority in the AFL to secure joint action. Locally, the TUUL assumed a variety of forms, including local industrial unions, local craft unions, shop committees, initiative organizing groups, and left-wing trade union groups. All these were linked together into citywide trade union unity councils. There was also provisions for state trade union unity councils, although none ever developed. The program of the TUUL. The Cleveland Convention organized the TUUL into a new trade union center, but the convention did not set up a general system of dual unionism. It declared against a policy of individual withdrawals or petty splits from the AFL, and it proposed to form new unions only where the AFL unions were decrepit or non-existent. It also warned repeatedly against slacking the work inside the AFL. The program said, "The new Trade Union Unity League has as its main task the organization of the unorganized into industrial unions independent of the AFL. At the same time, it organizes the workers within the reformist unions. It unites politically and organizationally the unemployed with the employed." Except for these important new union developments, the convention continued and developed the general policies of the old TUEL. It was distinctly a left convention. There were present but few outstanding trade union progressives. This was not remarkable, because at this time, the highest point of the Coolidge boom, the progressives were quite generally very enthused over trying to save the working class by the AFL Union Management Cooperation B&O plan method of speeding up production, and they rejected the TUUL line of militant class struggle as naive and outmoded. The convention made a head-on collision against the whole AFL employer scheme of intensified class collaboration, B&O plan, the higher strategy of labor, new wage policy, labor banking, etc. The heart of the convention was the struggle against capitalist rationalization of all its evil consequences of speed-up, unemployment, accidents, occupational sickness, low wages, etc. The convention declared for a militant strike policy. Its program was based on the class struggle, and its central slogan was "Class Against Class." The convention's main decisions were sloganized as follows: build the Trade Union Unity League, fight against imperialist war, defend the Soviet Union, fight against capitalist rationalization, organize the unorganized, for the 7-hour day, 5-day week, for social insurance, for full racial, social, and political equality for Negroes, organize the youth and women, defeat the misleaders of labor, for World Trade Union unity. The convention paid much attention to questions of industrial unionism, strike strategy, and the organization of the unorganized. It directed TUUL attention more sharply to the basic unorganized industries, steel, automobile, chemicals, agriculture, etc., and to work in the South. It discussed at length the problems of building shop committees in the mass production, trustified industries, and how to defeat bosses' spy and blacklist systems. It worked out the application of the United Front, especially between employed and unemployed, and between the AFL rank and file and the members of the TUUL unions. It stressed the policy of independent leadership by the workers as against their reactionary union officials. The convention also paid much attention to the special problem of Negro, youth, and women workers, questions which had been largely neglected in the early days of the TUUL. It declared its solidarity with the oppressed workers in the colonial and semi-colonial countries. It warned of the danger of imperialist war, especially war against the Soviet Union. With no illusions as to the extent or continuance of the prevailing prosperity, the convention adopted a demand for federal social insurance based on full wages for all workers incapacitated through unemployment, sickness, accident, or old age. The convention also modified the former TUEL attitude towards the Labor Party. In view of the prevailing reaction in union official circles, it declared for participation in the Labor Party only where it was actually a party in the hands of the workers. In the 1932 elections, the TUUL and its unions supported the Communist Party ticket, as the TUEL had done in 1924 and 1928. 1936. Chapter 20. The Organization of Negro Workers. One of the most important features of the Trade Union Educational League Convention, to be held in Cleveland on June 1st and 2nd, will be the large delegation of Negro workers present. To organize the Negro proletarians, to draw them into the mainstream of new revolutionary industrial union movement will be a major objective of the TUEL convention. Of all the shameful treason to the working class committed by the misleaders who head the old trade unions, none had been more disastrous than their systematic betrayal of the Negro workers. It has long been the policy of the employers to draw a line between white and black workers, to set one group against the other in order to better exploit them, to cultivate the worst forms of race prejudice among the whites. They have deliberately and systematically discriminated against the Negroes, giving them the worst work, the lowest wages, and subjecting them to the most brutal repression. Were the AFL leaders imbued with even a semblance of real working-class spirit, they would take it upon themselves as a first and basic task to defeat the plans of the employers by organizing the Negroes and by mobilizing the whole labor movement behind their elementary demands. But they refused utterly to do this. On the contrary, true to their role as agents of the bourgeoisie in the ranks of the workers, they fall in line with the program of the employers and join hands with them to oppress the Negroes. They cultivate race chauvinism among the whites. They prohibit Negroes from joining the unions. They cooperate with the employers to keep the Negroes at the poorest paid jobs. All this constitutes one of the most shameful pages in American labor history. But the TUEL Convention represents the revolutionary forces that will stop this historic treachery. The convention will be made up of a body of workers of both sexes and all nationalities, of Negroes who understand and dare to strike a blow on behalf of themselves and their class, and of the whites eliminating all white chauvinism from their ranks, recognize the Negro workers as class brothers, and who will fight with them and for them all the way to the end for complete social emancipation. The TUEL Convention will have more significance to Negro workers than any other trade union gathering ever held in this country. Negroes constantly take on more importance as a force in industry and as a potential factor in the trade union movement. During the past dozen years, hundreds of thousands of them have poured into the mills and factories. For the most part, they are going into the key and basic industries: coal, railroads, steel, meat packing, etc. Exactly those industries that play the most decisive role in the class struggle. In a recent number of the Red International of Labor Unions Bulletin occurs the following statement quoting Carol Binder regarding Negroes in the industries of Chicago in 1929. 30% of the labor force in the Chicago packing industry is colored. The Corn Products Company, which employed only one Negro 8 years ago, today employs 350, or 20% of its working force. Beaver's Products, 65%. The American Hide and Leather Company was the first tannery to use Negro workers. Now all the tanneries use large numbers of them. The foundries and laundries are heavy employers of Negroes. 11% of the employers of the Pullman car shops are Negroes. Negro women compose 40% of the workers in the lampshade industry. About 20% of the 14,000 postal workers of Chicago are Negroes. The great importance to industry and the class struggle of this constantly increasing body of Negro workers cannot be too much stressed. It is the special task of the TUEL to organize them as part of its general work of organizing the unorganized. This can only be done in the face of studied opposition of the AFL leaders working hand in glove with the employers. But in order that the necessary program should be registered by the TUEL Convention and the organization of the Negro workers, real work must be done by the left forces between now and the convention. Special committees must be established in the various important industrial centers to prosecute this particular task. These committees, together with the general organizing force of the TUEL, must establish contacts with the Negroes in all the important industrial plants and draw them into all the shop committees, TUEL groups, and other organizations formed as a basis for the convention. In every delegation from every industry where Negroes are employed, there must be a heavy percentage of these workers included. There especially must be a large delegation of Negro workers from the coal and iron mines, the steel mills, the fertilizer works, railroads, the cotton and tobacco plantations, and other industries of the South. The real mass character of the TUEL Convention will be measured pretty much by the number of representative Negro workers present. The Negro workers are good fighters. This they have proved in innumerable strikes in the coal, steel, packing, building, and other industries, despite systematic betrayal by white trade union leaders in the presence of an all too prevalent race chauvinism among the masses of white workers. They are a tremendous source of potential revolutionary strength and vigor. They have a double oppression as workers and as Negroes, to fill them with fighting spirit and resentment against capitalism. It has been one of the most serious errors of the left wing to underestimate and to neglect the development of this great proletarian fighting force. Let the TUEL convention therefore be a great mobilization center for the Negro workers. There must be present Negroes from all the important plants and localities. Such a delegation, upon which the success of the convention depends, can and will be assembled. The TUEL convention will be a revolutionary signal and inspiration to the masses of Negro workers exploited and oppressed in the mills, mines, and factories of American imperialism. 1929. Chapter 21. Demoralization and Decay. As a matter of fact, the new capitalism was only the old capitalism in a fresh guise. The boasted rationalization of industry could not and did not cure the great inner contradictions of the capitalist system, the contradiction between the social mode of production and the private ownership of industry, and the conflict between the rapidly increasing producing power of the toilers and their lagging purchasing power, which are the basic causes of the recurrent industrial crises. On the contrary, rationalization only intensified these fatal contradictions, the huge development of the productive forces during that period greatly hastening the whole system forward to the devastating international crash of 1929. Even a glance at the pages of Marx would have exposed this inevitable outcome. The whole rationalization business was a classical example of the suicide economics of capitalism. The much advertised paradise for the workers never materialized. During the Coolidge period, as we have already remarked, the workers as a class got very little out of the vastly increasing wealth that they produced, and their very efficiency was rushing them on to the later holocaust of unemployment and mass starvation. What the workers did get in the Coolidge period, however, was the gravest demoralization, both ideological and organizational. Confused by the bourgeoisification of their upper ranks of skilled workers, they lost much of their fighting spirit. Never in the history of the labor movement were strikes so few and trade union morale so low. For the first time in their entire existence, the trade unions failed to grow during a period of prosperity. On the contrary, they actually lost members. With a relatively good demand for labor powers, it should have been an easy matter to organize large numbers of workers, but the unions had all the vitality sucked and beaten out of them by the rationalization campaign, with its accompaniments of speed up, no strikes, surrender of union conditions, suppression of democracy, gangster control, expulsion of militants, and capitalist prosperity propaganda. The Socialist Party, saturated with class collaboration, dwindled away in influence and membership until in 1927 it had no more than 7,425 members. The Farmer Labor Party movement also practically disappeared, except in Minnesota, where it had become an established party. The IWW and such independent unions as the Amalgamated Food Workers, all of which had become penetrated with Coolidge prosperity illusions and lost their former militancy, declined heavily in membership and influence. The Coolidge era was the period of the deepest confusion and demoralization in the history of the American working class. The class collaboration poison was eating the very heart out of the labor movement. And upon this scene of working class paralysis, the capitalists and their hangers-on could and did look with smug satisfaction. Thoughts of industrial crisis and strikes, not to speak of revolution, were far from their minds where America was concerned. They were drunk with power and prosperity. Their great enemy, the proletariat, seemed to be hopelessly drugged into insensibility and bound hand and foot by its official leaders. But they were living in a fool's paradise, as the next few years showed. 1936. And that is the end of American Trade Unionism, chapters 18, 19, 20, and 21. Thank you for listening to the Workers' Reading Room. Have a good evening.